When the rain don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. When the rain don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. And it won't do no good to be crying out loud, babe, or cursing the sky.
Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and I'm joined today by Joanne Sheehan, who is, I guess she's a long-time Northeast Regional staffer for the War Resisters League and a fellow member of the Connecticut Committee for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I have to say, I invited Joanne to come on today because I spent last weekend doing my taxes. At the same time, grumbling about it, and thought, we've been talking a lot in New London about how where you put your money is the true expression of your values. So I thought it would be a really good time to talk a little bit about where a lot of our money's going. So welcome, Joanne.
Oh, thanks, Rana. Yes, 'tis the season to talk about where your tax dollars really go.
So I guess to start out, maybe you can just say a little bit about the War Resisters League and also about our newer, more informal committee.
Sure, yeah. Well, War Resisters League is in our 99th year, so we'll be 100 next year. And basically an organization that believes that war is a crime against humanity. And so we work nonviolently to remove the causes of war. For more than 50 years, we have focused on issues of tax resistance, actually probably since the late 40s, since the after World War II, and have created this where your tax dollars really go, kind of what we call the pie chart, to show that we are, on average, spending about half of our taxes that goes into the military, into various aspects of the military. Which, what we hear about is welfare queens and too much money for people who aren't working and too much money going for all of these other, kind of quote unquote social needs, where really it's corporate welfare that's really the problem here.
And, I guess the complaints don't stick because I remember 25 years ago, complaining about how, the pricing was so out of whack for military contractors. The $300 toilet seats made the news for a short time, but it didn't really stick that maybe that money wasn't necessarily being spent wisely.
Well, I think a couple of things, right? One is that these companies have big PR machines, right? And so they try to counter kind of those reality checks around jobs. And we know that here in southeastern Connecticut, right? Nobody really talks about, the submarine outside of, well, it will protect us. But it's really a job producer. And that's kind of how you see the congressman and the corporation kind of talking about that, right? And so kind of the counter to that doesn't have that same PR machine. We don't have that kind of, those billions to spend on that. And I think that the way that the government promotes kind of what they do it as a pie chart, if you will, of the entire budget. So if you add Social Security and you add all of these restricted trusts, then the military spending looks smaller and smaller and smaller. And if you only do it on DOD, you're not talking about Department of Energy. They have responsibility for all the nuclear weapons. So that's a huge amount. And then you're talking about NASA and some of their work as military. So what we do is really analyze the entire spending, take out the restricted spending, and then what your tax dollars actually do go is to half of it. But yeah, I think on some level it doesn't stick because people feel like, well, I have to pay my taxes, so I don't really want to know. I hear that a lot. And then, oh, but these are jobs.
And I have this slide. I'll ask Drew to put it up. That I don't know. Someone must have posted on Facebook not long ago. I hope the slide video is going through. But Noam Chomsky had, provided the opinion that, when we pay our taxes, we really should be celebrating if our taxes were going for things that we had decided were important. And, if our infrastructure was going to be top notch, if our, if our social service needs were going to be taken care of. This, I don't know why that looks funny, but I don't know if we can get, we'll see. Hopefully we'll get the slide.
There we go.
So there. So yeah, and the day you pay your taxes would be a day of celebration. And I don't know of anyone who's really celebrating.
No.
So this is a part of the pie chart that War Resisters League. I don't know why it's pinker on screen than it is on
red.
paper, but but this is where our money is going, and maybe talk. You mentioned a little bit about how the calculation was arrived at, and before the show, you mentioned that actually it's a more conservative than real number unintentionally this year.
Right. Yeah, this year it looks a little different. Usually it really is much closer to 47 to 50%. A couple of things make it a little smaller this year, make it look smaller this year. Not that the spending is really smaller. One is all the COVID spending that has been put in. So another thing I should say is that the Congress and the White House and Congress have been releasing the budget later and later and later. And so we don't get it until right before April 15th. And so we end up at War Resisters League working off of previous budgets more than present budgets, right? And so last year's budget clearly had a lot more COVID money in there. So that makes human resources at this point a clear 50% on this, right?
Right.
The other thing that you don't see on this is money for Ukraine, because that wasn't in last year's budget. And oftentimes, as we saw with Iraq and Afghanistan, they had these addendum spending. So it wasn't even in the annual budget. So it's hidden in a certain kind of way, right? So since the Biden administration came in, we have given $2 billion to Ukraine. The far majority of that, from what I can tell, it's close to 90% are weapons. So when we think of aid, we think, oh, good, they're helping folks, right? They're giving humanitarian aid. They're giving money for all the refugees to get out. They're doing, they're getting food into Kyiv and those places. No, these are weapons that the United States is buying or has in our stock, and so we count that. So they have gotten $2 billion since the Biden administration is in, and over $1 billion of that in mid-March alone. So that's not on this pie chart alone, so at all. So that's where people do need to look at, and of course the corporate, the amount of money then that's going to corporations. This is putting huge amounts of profits into the pocket of kind of the big five, right? Which is General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing. So that they're really benefiting, and have actually been benefiting by the spread of NATO and all of that over the years. So there's a lot more military spending than what's in our own budget as well, because money is coming. We give money to NATO, NATO buys planes, right? So it's not all in here in the same way.
Yeah. And this is part of the backside of it, talking about, well, who are the victims and who are the winners? And the winners are the companies, and they're I have later in the slide of Eisenhower's farewell speech, but one thing he mentioned is how it affects every state house in every state
That's right.
in the country. So, I was in Maine a few years ago helping Lisa Savage's senatorial campaign there, and Bath Iron Works is in Maine, and a lot of their experiences with having an employer like Bath Iron Works, which is also under General Dynamics, is so parallel to what it's like having EB in our backyard.
That's right. And we've actually worked with the folks who have done work around economic conversion for Bath Iron Works. And there are a number of networks, including the in this past year, the War Industry Resisters Network, of folks who have been connecting, because we do this work around these war industries, and connecting groups that are doing things focused on the same corporations as well, kind of looking at our strategy. But the folks up doing that work at Bath Iron Works have been people who have been part of the movement for decades, as I have been. And so, there's a lot of kind of sharing of information. Yeah.
So I guess some people would argue that, our municipalities are winners too. As we were driving into the studio, there's a huge, housing complex being built, in Waterford on Willits. They're being built all over in New London in anticipation of a lot of jobs and an influx of people. Is this really a win? I guess that's a question.
And I think today's editorial also talked about kind of, economic development, and I think as somebody who also works with the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust, and so working on housing and seeing the struggle of families who are, we do their pie chart, they're paying more than 50% of their income, often to corporate renters or to large landlords in town, right? They're not benefiting at all. Like, the question is, when we say the municipality, who do we mean? Do we mean the people who live here? How much are they benefiting? Many of these jobs, many of these apartment complexes are for young engineers moving into the community to get these jobs. They're not our local people. They're not certainly our local Black and brown people who are getting jobs and benefiting from this local corporation.
And another piece of it is it's mostly, almost entirely rental property, so even the cities don't anticipate that these young engineers will necessarily make this their forever home.
Right. That these are for a certain demographic of young folks without children who are transient. Now, will they in the long run stay here, make this place there? We'll have to see. We're going into the building of the new Columbia class, right? The replacement of Trident. And so we're kind of at the beginning of that growth in jobs. But what we've seen in the past is there's a difference also between the engineers and the people who work in the yard. There's a big difference in terms of what they're making. There's not a big housing boom for the lower paid folks. There's a big housing boom in New London, really, because this is the first time we've had that many people employed here. But this is a boom and bust cycle. Let's be clear about that, right? As opposed to the generations of people who have lived here who are still struggling and struggled through the Trident boom and are struggling still today. So I think the question of municipalities, and not just to pick on New London, it's every, I think, municipality that has a weapons manufacturer there, has almost any, but weapons manufacturers are different because they're government, and so there's a different kind of relationship that folks have, I think, with it. And because if you question the weapons they're making, then you get you're not patriotic, you're leaving us open to attack, where I think the opposite is true. You're making yourself more vulnerable to that.
Right.
So I think that the real question here needs to be, how are people really benefiting? How are individuals benefiting? And when the government spends this amount of money on military spending to corporations that make huge profits, and then we're told, well, there's no more money for COVID. There's no more money we don't have money for hospitals. We can't stretch that money. What about affordable housing, monies to be able to make permanently affordable home ownership, those kinds of things. Those programs there, they need the funding. We need the funding to make that happen, but then it's all, geared towards to the military spending.
And I do wonder, I worry in New London because I'm not even sure we can count on the New London facility, EB facility, to be as long-lived in that location as the industry as a whole, because this is an industry where security is tight, and if they had the space in Groton, they'd rather have everything all in one place because it's so much easier to keep things secure if you're in one spot than if you're going back and forth between two.
Right.
So I even feel as though beyond the fact that, the industry in 50 years, we probably won't see subs as something that our country really needs. But even before it goes bust, it could go bust in New London.
Sure. And I think one of the problems arises that we are really looking at, we're talking about taxes, we're looking at our federal taxes, right? But the reality is that there is a tax implication on the state level and on the local level, right? The EB has a tax break for that facility here in New London, just like Pfizer did before that, right? And the state gives tax money. Right now we're seeing kind of, I think it was just last week that the Lamont administration talked about giving Sikorsky, $75 million in breaks to stay in the state and to provide 7,000 jobs in the state. So we are always putting enormous amounts of money or giving tax breaks or spending staff time of our municipalities to kind of service these corporations that have massive profits, who have, for the most part, for some of them, like General Dynamics, one customer, right? Single payer, and we're the payers.
Yeah.
Everyone writing the tax, we're the payers, right? And whether it's we need more money to dredge the river, we need this, we need that, and then it's like, people say, well, if you don't give them that money, they'll leave. Well, I doubt this 92 acres that they've built in Groton is ever going to be able to be replaced anywhere else.
Right.
But that's one of the tricks that the corporations play on all levels of our government, right? Like, no, if we don't get more money, if you don't build this housing, if you don't dredge this river, and as somebody said to me, they remember that 30 so years ago when the Trident began to be built, everybody was trained in-house. That's what you did, right? Now we've got STEM programs geared to our middle school, and we've got community colleges that are doing the training. And again, our state money is going into paying for a private corporation to have these skills. And the reality is that what they do at Electric Boat is not transferable to other jobs, right? That if you can wire a missile tube, it's very different than wiring a house. So your electrical license is very different. All of those things are different, right? So you can't just say, we're just trying to make a lot of electricians. We're trying to make a lot of electricians to work for one company.
And when you were talking about the subsidies, I always recommend that people look up Art Rolnick, who is an economist who worked for the Minneapolis Federal Reserve for many years as their research person on economic development. And he came up, studied subsidies in general. His specialty wasn't really looking into the military-industrial complex. So, he looked at sports stadiums, actually, as one example of subsidies and where you end up with bidding wars among various municipalities. And he said that it's not ever a win for the municipalities to go that route. It pits communities, towns, one against the other, and it sets up an expectation among corporations that they wherever they go, they're going to get these subsidies. And
Right.
investing in the human infrastructure is really the way to go. And this was an economist. He's left the Fed, and I think he's still, for a big speaking fee, will come and talk to people about how regular, what we've seen as typical subsidies to bring industries in really are very, very rarely winners for those paying the subsidies.
You've mentioned him to me, and here's a connection that I'm just kind of remembering. So at the end of the Cold War, there was what was called a peace dividend, right? That there was a reduction in military
right.
spending. Now, a big cut of that came out of the Seawolf program here in General Dynamics. So they cut a major part. It was a Democratic state. It was George H.W. Bush, so no sweat off his back to kind of, decimate a submarine program in a Democratic state, right? And people here started doing a lot of organizing, save our state, save our subs. That meant a lot of us who had been looking at these issues of economic conversion began to really do organizing around that. We ended up working with the Corporation for Regional Economic Development. We ended up working with some of the union folks and kind of looking at, well, how do you retrain people for other jobs, and kind of, what the company wouldn't put into kind of transferring folks out. But the peace dividend piece of it went to lots of things in this area, and one was to Dodge Stadium. So there was actually military money that went into the stadium. And then I remember going to some of the hearings, and the politicians would say, there'll be hundreds of jobs. Well, the hundreds of jobs were like the toilets that were going to be put in once. They're not hundreds of jobs. And I have to say, I'm a baseball fan. I love going to Dodge Stadium, but it was not a good use. And as a Norwich resident, I'm still paying for that. Oh, we need another fence. We need some more work in the, in the locker rooms. It's kind of like they keep coming back to us as, and as well, it's not really owned by Major League Baseball. And again, it's back to the individual folks. While you've got, that there's a disconnect between the very large, very rich Major League teams and who's playing here. And again, it's all off our backs, and we just keep, people just keep, what else? What are you going to do? You can't fight City Hall. You can't fight Congress. You can't fight the White House.
And you can't even fight the local baseball league. So now I'm going to go back to, it's April. And so after I did my taxes over the weekend, yesterday was April 4th, and St. Francis House for many years has hosted a reading of the Martin Luther King Declaration of Independence from the war in Vietnam on April 4th.
Yep.
So, reading, I got there late, but I was there at the end. And reading the words, it's like, what has changed and what has not changed in the 55 years since those words were spoken?
Yeah, Ronna, I think the tradition of reading this here in New London started at the beginning of the Iraq War, when there were a number of groups that came together and read it in front of the post office, because at some point, one of us is going off here.
I think it's you. I stay muted all the time, so I miss.
I
miss phone calls, but.
I don't know where it is now. Sorry about
well,
this.
they'll give up.
Yeah, right. Just throw it over there. Now where was I here?
They're starting to read.
We were reading
during the Iraq War.
We're reading, right? We were reading Martin Luther King's Declaration of Independence against the war at the beginning of the Iraq War. And we're reading it at the post office because at that point in time, if you recall, the sanctions actually prohibited anything from going to Iraq, including medical supplies. And so there was an action of bringing medical supplies to the post office. And then, of course, they were rejected. And reading this. And a number of people had a hard time not saying Iraq instead of Vietnam, or just feeling like we were talking about the same thing. You know, that war is war. War is a crime against humanity. Kind of the excuses are kind of the same. You know, there's, but they're evil because, but we have to go in there because. They never really talk about the resources that we will grab from these places and the like. And so, having been part of many of these readings in the past 20 years, I felt yesterday in being part of that reading that you could easily zip in Ukraine in a couple of different places. Now, the dynamics of the war are clearly different. The U.S. role is different, although we play a pretty key role here. The build-up prior to it is very, I think there was an emphasis that I forgot about in hearing about it yesterday in terms of the U.S. role in paying for the French war against the Vietnamese, right? And then how we stepped in, right? And can you look at our role in NATO, the U.S. role in NATO since the end of the Cold War, and our role in building that up, the role of these corporations in making money off of all of these now Eastern European nations that are buying things from Lockheed Martin, that are buying things from General Electric and other companies, right? That, and there are a couple of places that I noted that I think ring a bell. And this quote is one of the ones we probably hear the most. But when machines and computers, profit and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of extreme militarism, racism, and extreme materialism, racism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. And so we see that. We've seen, we've seen the racism in Ukraine, even as the African students, who Ukraine was clearly benefiting from having all of these students, were suddenly not allowed on the trains, or not allowed out, or get in the back of the line, constantly for days and days and days, and how people were treated there. And I think there are a few others that struck me. And here, I think, anytime we look at these pie charts, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And so here we are, that, I can't remember exactly what the Albert Einstein quote is, but if you prepare for war, you get war. If you prepare for peace, you're more likely to get peace. And this Cold War has taken on clearly kind of different characteristics since the end of the Cold War, but it's never really ended. And we've continued to fuel it with more weapons. And I am not one of the peace activists who blame this all on the United States by any, as a pacifist organization, as a pacifist myself, we feel that disarming, demilitarizing, looking at other ways of addressing conflict. And people say, well, you're so naive. All wars end with diplomacy. Why can't they begin with that? Why can't we look at that? We can, and we can do that, right? And we know that conflicts have been avoided by that, and that we also knew that part of this whole saber rattling was Ukraine constantly pushing for being part of NATO, and which means having all those weapons closer. So I think very clearly that it's a demilitarization rather than a militarization that will avoid war and still protect people.
Well, one thing that struck me listening to and reading the words yesterday, it was just
It was only yesterday.
Yeah, was the framing that's still so accurate of it being like a class war in many ways. And I keep thinking, the leaders of all these countries, the privileged classes, the elite, they kind of all know each other, but they're not the ones who are like putting their lives on the line. And it seems like, now that our army is, we don't have a draft.
Right.
And even when we did, people of low status classes were disproportionately represented, but it's probably even more now. And these are people who are going to other countries where they don't know the people they're fighting against. And it's just a weird dynamic that the leaders kind of have been in the same room together and have talked to each other, but the people actually paying the price don't know each other and don't really hold these personal grudges. It's just a funny dynamic, I think.
Well, I think it's, at the beginning of this war, one of the things that I think we heard was often that the dynamic of the Russians and the Ukrainians, many who speak the same language and who are really in many ways related. Some of them literally are related, right? That I think that they said that one of the things that they intercepted was a tank driver saying, "Who do we shoot at? They look like us." That because we built up this war as the other. The only way we can shoot people, the only way we can kill people is the other. So Putin has become the other, and he's an easy other. But he's in the basement, of the Kremlin. He's not out there in line, right? So he's kind of the stand-in, and you understand kind of where the generals are with that kind of level. But that the average person on the ground is, I'm sure would much rather not be doing what they're doing. No matter how much we hear of Ukrainian patriotism and we're going to protect our land. Obviously, they want to protect their land, and there are many different ways of protecting their land, right? But killing and being killed, and the trauma of this, I think that one of the things that I worry about as somebody who's been very active with War Resisters International for many years, as well as became an anti-war activist during Vietnam, is the trauma this is creating among everyone. The trauma among all of the Ukrainians, whether that be the people who have had to escape as refugees, the people stuck in their basements, the people who are fighting in the war. No matter how noble we put all of that out, the reality is that this trauma, the psychological trauma and the physical trauma will be with us for generations. And is this really what we want to be doing? And if not, then we have to stop preparing for war. We have to stop sending fighter jets and thinking that protects us. We have to stop building submarines and think, oh, no one will attack us if we have a submarine, or all of the submarines we have, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we just have to change our thinking there. And then we also have to realize that as we are on Thinking Green, what is the environmental problem here? That the Department of Defense is the largest burner, let's say, of petroleum in the country. And just one practice fighter jet, one run by a fighter jet is, I think, 2 years of you not driving your car, right? So no matter how much we try to think about how we're going to save this planet, then we have the burn pits now, people coming back with, all sorts of physical problems from the burn pits in Iraq. We have fighter jets, just like I said, just their practice runs, plus all of the huge amount of petroleum that they're burning is killing all of us.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking about two things. One, during the reading yesterday, you're talking about the trauma. Even though, this Beyond Vietnam speech was 55 years ago, we actually still have among us people who were traumatized
very much so
by that experience. And so this is a cost to people and to our system, as a whole, that lingers for a very, very long time.
Right. I mean, just right among us was Cal Robertson,
Right.
right? So people in London in this area know Cal and know of his anti-war presence. And, he did 2 tours of duty in Vietnam and came back a destroyed person, physically and mentally. And he's that story from him telling it, right?
Yes.
And we know so many more. We're at that age that these are folks we know. We also know how many have died already. They've died. Well, they died in war. They've died as single car accidents, many of which are considered to be suicides. They've died of suicide. Many are the homeless on the streets, the people who are not able to kind of really function in any way very easily because of the trauma of war, because of what they were made to do, because of what they saw, because of all of that. And that just to continue to do that to human beings, both sides. If you're being really selfish, think about what you're doing to your own people. And we need to not be very selfish and think about what are we doing? What trauma do we continue to cause?
To us and to them.
To us and to them. There has to be no us versus them, right? That's the part of the problem is to go to war, there is the versus, there is the kind of those are the evil people. That's why this whole, these are the Nazis, these are the not, like the language we always hear around war, how people are. But we're here to kill the Nazis, or we're here to get rid of the Nazis. It's like, where are the Nazis, And instead they're killing the average citizens of Ukraine.
So I just put in a little slide for last January, just a couple months ago, we had a demonstration on the Prohibition anniversary of the Prohibition of nuclear weapons, which is a treaty that we did not sign. None of the nuclear weapons countries did sign. There were quite a few of us lined up on Howard Street, and I don't know. It's hard to gauge what the response is. Some of the EB people leaving were very supportive, but I don't know. I feel like it got people's attention, but I don't know how people react to it.
Right. And I think, when we did the strategy for putting that together, one of the things that we want to be clear about is that Electric Boat builds nuclear weapons. That one of the things we have often heard, for those of us who have lived here for decades, is no, we don't. We build platforms. Now, we don't build the missile. That is built by Lockheed Martin.
Right.
But that missile could not be fired without the high technology that is put on these submarines, right? And so it is really important that we understand that that's what we do. Not just we build boats. We build boats that fire nuclear weapons, that none of those nuclear weapons are anywhere near as small as the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we need to own up to that. And if that's what you want to do, can you defend that? What I hear is, I don't really do that, as opposed to what that is. So I think part of what we're trying to say is, we do build nuclear weapons. That's like, if you want to be, that is what is being done here. And let's face that reality, just like going to war is more than we're just protecting our homeland kind of thing, right? So let's really look at that and say, do we really want to do this? And I think the power of this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which a lot of folks, a lot of government people around the world, a lot of activists, a lot of environmental activists and anti-militarists worked very hard for a long time. And now it's nearing 60 countries. It became legal in the United Nations once 50 countries signed it. So that was, as you said, a year ago, last January, what we did, right? And the 9 nuclear powers have not signed it and have no intention of signing it. And then the 5 NATO countries that base our nuclear weapons, they don't making, in Turkey, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, these are countries that don't make nuclear weapons, but have our nuclear weapons based there, so that they're close. Why? So they're closer to this to Russia, right? Let's be real as to why they're there, right? And so it really shows, I think, a lot of kind of what the global community looks like. Who's signing on to this, right? The countries that are signing on feel more victimized by this. Victimized because they're smaller, they're island communities, increasingly we are seeing more, I think, since even in the year between the first demonstration and the year anniversary next, we saw more countries, larger countries around the world signing on to this. And I think that you will see that. And I think, both during the Trump administration, when people realized what it meant for Trump to have that power, and now what it means that if we do, and I think most people don't want this, but if a no-fly zone means United
means
States
we're shooting things down.
Shooting down Russian planes, and what they're going to do is up the ante. What's up in the ante? Chemical, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons, right? So getting worse and worse and worse, right? So that, our policy is called mutually assured destruction, right? That means, and let's be very clear, Southeastern Connecticut is one of the targets, because blowing us up would mean getting rid of all the nuclear weapons that could then continue to shoot off to Russia. So it is mad. It is mutually assured destruction.
Yes.
It is mad. And again, we're spending all of this amount of money kind of making this mad policy. And now the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have this clock that they've had for decades pointing to how many minutes to midnight. And we are dangerously close to using those nuclear weapons. And there have been many, many times when they were almost used because of mistakes that were made, because when there is something happening, when there is this kind of conflict happening in the world, it's easier to make mistakes because it's easier to believe you might really be being attacked. And so the finger on the trigger is a little itchier, a little antsier, a little more, very much more problematic.
Yeah, that all is pretty scary. You mentioned, while we're talking about the committee, we followed up, and I did not get to the event where a leaflet was given to the people who went to see Don't Look Up at the Guard. But you can see it here on your screen.
Yeah, I have a copy
and you have a copy.
I do.
And you would talk, and the focus of it is what subs, don't help us with, and what they actually hurt us with, and maybe tell the story a little bit about our
work, right? I think that, this year, as we were talking about this whole issue that we as we look strategically at what is our role in this committee for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and how are we trying to kind of address, what issues are and what we hear from, because we live here, from our neighbors, from our friends, and the people we leaflet, that by having subs, they protect us. That as people who are concerned about the economic insecurity that we've just talked about, and climate change, that subs can't protect us from that. Actually, they destabilize those situations in many ways that we've also talked about.
And that isn't taken into account much. I was on a panel maybe 6 months ago, something about climate, impacts on shoreline towns. And one person had asked a question, it was a Zoom, and in the chat, something about what was your opinion about, the findings of Governor Lamont's, panel, group addressing climate change. And I hadn't read it before. I quickly looked it up, and it mentioned nothing about all the military industries in our state. It was just totally left out of the equation. And it's like, speaking of elephants in the room,
right?
I think that this is something that's really important to bring this piece of, impact on climate back to our, investment in military endeavors.
That's right. That's right. And again, we see this connection, and it's not just kind of their, fighter jets, but the technology and all that is needed to make a submarine is a high energy use kind of production system, right? A lot of that well before it even gets to southeastern Connecticut in terms of the steel needed, in terms of all of that, right? And so it is problematic. And then we also see that subs can't save us from war. We had submarines on 9/11, and that didn't prevent 9/11. We have submarines now, and while we may go out there and at times, cruise missiles, non-nuclear tipped cruise missiles have been used off of submarines in wars in the last 20, 25 years. The idea that a intercontinental ballistic missile, which are nuclear tipped, there's no non-nuclear tipped ICBMs, can save us or can save the world is ridiculous. And so I think that, sure, for those of us who had seen Don't Look Up, we clearly, I think, saw clearly what the connection is around climate change, that we're not paying attention. Another UN study came out yesterday that makes it, looks even worse again, right? Like we're just moving forward here, right? But that making that connection too of our own denial around nuclear weapons, whether that be I don't make nuclear weapons when you're making a Trident submarine or a Columbia class submarine, or they will never be used. And now we're a few minutes to midnight, and there's a real. I heard a discussion on the radio about nuclear weapons, and the journalist asked the kind of expert on it something about, what about a Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapon being used? The person being interviewed said, we don't make those kinds of nuclear weapons anymore. We make massive amounts of nuclear weapons now, right? If it's mutually assured destruction, then it will destroy. I mean, even we look at Chernobyl, and what's happened is even driving military vehicles over the land, over the dust, is stirring up the radioactivity that's in the soil. The other issue around nuclear weapons and nuclear power, I dare say, or what do we do with the waste? It lasts for 2,500 years at a minimum.
The rods, and even from, the peaceful uses, the rods are still on the millstone roof.
They're right here. That's right.
And with sea level rise. Well, we have 5 minutes, and in like 3 of those, so what should people do? What can people do to keep from either being too complacent or in denial or in despair? So how do you keep going?
Or in despair. I think part of the question is how to look at this and not get overwhelmed. And I think for most, when we see social change happening, even though we have a number of examples of brave individuals, most of the time we realize there's a large community of folks involved in that, whether it be, even we'll look at Martin Luther King Jr., right? He didn't stand alone.
Right.
And he would be the first person to tell you that, right? And I think any of these folks would be. So what can you do? I would say find other people who think this way, and find where your passion is. Is it mostly climate change? Is it mostly anti-racism work? Is it mostly anti-militarism? These issues are connected. We're no longer working in little silos that says, no, none of this connects, right? Martin Luther King Jr. said there's a connection here between poverty, racism, and militarism, right? Like you can't take them apart. And so I encourage people to do work that they care most about, because if we don't do something we care most about, then it becomes overwhelming, it becomes a burden, or we burn out too easily, right? Be informed. Who do you trust in these kinds of information? One of the things we do at War Resisters League, or this pie chart, is explain exactly where we get the statistics. People are like, where do you get that stuff? Well, we get it from the United States government because they're the one who put the budget out. It's how we analyze it differently than others, as I explained before, because Military spending is more than just Department of Defense. It's kind of, so understand the issues, get an understanding of where you can go outside of corporate mainstream media to get information and analysis, right? Get both of that. And then find other ways to kind of, share that information. There's a number of things on what you could do on the back of the War Resisters League pie chart. And you can go on warresisters.org and you'll find the pie chart and other information that encourages folks to help get involved in divestment campaigns and the like. You can, if you're choosing to pay your taxes, pay them and send a protest letter in there. A number of people get the pie chart and send that. You can, if you need one copy this week, you can print that off of the War Resisters website, right? Let them know, right? Like that, and send a copy of that to your congressman and to your senators and say, no, right? I don't want to be paying for this war, and continue to let them know, because I think that people give up on letting them know. Then they think, oh, they're getting patted on the back, they're getting corporate donations, and how do we counter some of that kind of thing, right? And so, a lot of folks are getting things like the where your tax dollars go and sending them out to folks and letting, getting that, doing that kind of education in your community, right? So, get involved in climate change groups. There's a lot of them out there. I think that it really is a matter of finding what your passion, finding out if you care about nuclear weapons, join us in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. If you care about these issues, find other folks who care about them, and then think strategically about how to do things. So it's not an easy question, because as somebody who really feels like campaigns are important, strategy is important, it's not just about read every Facebook piece you can on it, because that'll drive you crazy.
Yeah. And because we have only about a minute, and you mentioned alternative media, I have one last slide. I'm going to end with a pitch for public access TV.
Great.
Because most forms of the media nowadays do have some kind of corporate dimension, and that those corporate pieces are getting money from those who, like big money, not just the military industry, but big pharma, big insurance companies. So much of the mainstream media is tainted by the fact that big advertisers get some kind of treatment, some kind of notice that some of us little people don't, even if their motives aren't evil. So this year, this session in the state legislature, there's a Senate Bill 278 that updates funding for public access now that fewer people are using cable and more are streaming in different modes. Even in our case, where we do put our shows on YouTube, we have use of this studio to present different points of view, and so this is important.
Yep.
So SB 278, get in touch with your state senators, and thank you, Joanne. I think we are out of time now.
Thank you. This is a great conversation.
And and people can look up War Resisters League. People can get in touch with the committee. We do have an email address. You might not get an answer immediately, but you will hear back. And I'm not sure what we're going to be doing next week. In 2 weeks, we'll have a couple people from OutCT talking about their plans. So have a good week, everyone, and thank you, Joanne.
Thank you. All right.
When the rain don't